So, hello and welcome to Beginner Strategies for Building a More Inclusive Workplace. This is our 2021 Summer Lunch and Learn series hosted by MARIANA Strategies. And my name is Audrey Ruffey. I'm here with my colleague, Swati Srivastava, and we're from MARIANA Strategies. We're a workplace culture consulting firm with offices in Washington, D.C. and in Chicago. And we help organizations and businesses build inclusive, safe, and equitable workplaces. And we're here hosting this series to talk about not the new normal, but the next normal. We're in a moment of transition. Hopefully you and your families are safe and healthy, and we're coming out of a long period of difficulty and change and trying to harness the power that people are feeling for positive change. And that's why we're here today, talking about beginner strategies for building a more inclusive workplace. We know it can seem daunting. That's something that we've heard from a lot of folks, but we ask ourselves, why is it important to begin your diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy by building inclusive culture? When we start with inclusive culture, we're in a better position to hire people from different backgrounds and have them feel valued, trusted, and able to be their authentic selves in the workplace. To put it another way, we can't hire for diversity and hope that inclusion will just happen. It won't, and our great hires will leave. So that's why we start here and we look for things that we can do, things that we can start off the bat and get good momentum going. In this discussion, we're going to be talking about the 3 pillars of an inclusive workplace, what you can do to measure inclusion, and key strategies for building it at work. With that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself, and I'll have Swati introduce herself. My name is Audrey. My pronouns are she and hers. I founded MARIANA Strategies about 4 years ago, and I'm a licensed attorney and a change management practitioner. But the reason I do this work is because I've had the experience of being in a workplace where I felt like I could fire on all cylinders for the work I was meant to do. The partner at the law firm I worked for entrusted me with serious responsibility, and I got to do everything in my power to do it. And it felt great. And I never worried about whether I felt excluded. And I want everyone to feel that way at work. That's why I started this company. I want people to not be harassed at work, discriminated against. I want them to bring their full selves to work. And we help workplaces do that. Swati?
Hi, everyone. My name is Swati Srivastava. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a social psychologist, and I come from a background of organizational consulting and nearly 2 decades of survey research. I represent the Chicago office of MARIANA Strategies, and I am really glad to be doing this session with you all today. So, we are talking about this Lunch and Learn series, and that's exactly what it is. For those of you who joined us last time, we had talked about practices that are applicable in a variety of workplaces to support the next transition into a hybrid workplace. Today, as Audrey just mentioned, we're going to be talking about beginner strategies for building a more inclusive workplace, pillars of inclusion, how to measure inclusion, key strategies for building inclusion, and how inclusion is linked to equity, how both together make diverse workplaces sustainable. In our next session, we're going to talk about inclusive leadership, what leaders need to know, understanding why leadership engagement is crucial to your DEI efforts, how leaders can use empathy and self-awareness to understand DEI challenges, essential DEI communication skills such as transparency, vulnerability, and accountability. And we'll talk about applying inclusive leadership to critical organizational functions, such as recruitment, hiring, retention, measuring people against inclusive culture values, and ensuring performance reviews are bias-proof, equity in pay, and of course, inclusive culture. On September 2nd, we'll be talking about the role we all play in making workplaces more inclusive and the importance of ensuring everyone is equipped to make change. We'll discuss empathy as a skill for understanding harm and strategies for healing. We'll talk about speaking up when we see something inappropriate. We'll discuss prioritizing impact over intent. and leaning into discomfort as a tool for growth. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, and as a reminder for everyone else who joined us last time, we are MARIANA Strategies. As Audrey mentioned, we're a workplace culture consulting practice that provides diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting, workshops, and strategic advice for businesses and nonprofits in New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago, and beyond. We do this through analysis, engagement, facilitated conversations, and we help organizations build and support equitable, inclusive, and safe working environments. So before we begin our discussion today, we'd like to hear from you about what types of challenges your workplace has faced when it comes to building an inclusive culture. Some of you who joined earlier already saw the Mentimeter question. Here it is again. So if you can just take a moment to either use the QR code or visit the Menti site. The link is also in the chat, and answer this question for us. What challenges has your organization faced in building an inclusive workplace?
And Swati, do we want to look at the results right away, or are we going to save this for later?
I think let's save this for a few slides down.
Okay, great. I can throw out one of my own as folks are thinking about them early on in my career at the same law firm where I felt the sense of being trusted by the partner who was also my mentor. I also felt a fear of speaking up and routinely got talked over and would often be mistaken for a stenographer when I would appear in court. Those are some of the ways that I did not feel included, and the ways that I did were feeling a sense that I was given great responsibility because I could do the work. How about you?
Oh, me. Things that I feel I have felt excluded many a time, being mistaken for other colleagues. But as an organization, I think that a few organizations I have worked with in the past, the barriers that I would see would be leadership, really just not seeing the benefits of having to do the work to build an inclusive workplace. And, you know, earlier in my career, I wasn't able to articulate or talk to those points very clearly, but we will definitely discuss that today.
Absolutely. So I'm glad that we've given folks a moment to think about those challenges. And it's not just the evergreen challenges, the ones that Swati just mentioned about leadership, but we see some things that are quite new that we want to be talking about, facing. I'm sure maybe I could get a show of hands for folks who know of people who are changing jobs, who've decided their experience with the pandemic has meant I need a change. And that's something we're definitely hearing, and that's affecting our work, our experience with our clients is certainly that people want to know that the workplace they're going to really does what they're laying out as their values when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We see that prospective employees want to know what it's like to work at a company, but what my experience is like might be really different than Swati's or someone else's. And they want to understand that experience, that perspective from a person who identifies as Black, as a woman of color, as disabled, Latinx. And right now, this means that people are setting a higher bar. And they want employers to be as committed to challenging themselves and changing themselves through not just hiring a more diverse workforce, but retaining and helping them thrive in that workplace. Seeing people rise to the ranks, being given stretch assignments, and facilitating uncomfortable conversations, especially about issues of systemic racism, right? So it has to go past mission statements, right? It's more than tweets about current events. They have to be more than just performance. And people are very attuned to that right now. So what we're seeing are some of the things you see up here on the screen about Glassdoor beginning earlier this year to allow people to post their information, sharing details about their experience in the workplace, including aspects of their identity, so that that data can be made clear across industries and across companies. And according to a survey from Glassdoor that was taken last September, more than 3/4 of employees and job seekers said that a diverse workforce was important when evaluating job offers, when evaluating companies. And for nearly half of employees who identified as Black or as Hispanic, said they had quit a job after witnessing or experiencing discrimination at work. So right now, instead of statements, people want to see data, right? And that is the Glassdoor policy of disclosing race and gender data on its employment site, and breaking down how people rank their workplaces, how women rank their workplaces, how people of color rank their workplaces. And this is a virtuous thing to allow companies to be incentivized to improve. And so that's where we are in 2021 in this next normal. And we want to think about what we can do given that state of affairs.
So just to set the context for today's discussion, the beginner principles that we're going to talk about are applicable to all organizations, no matter the size or the industry. But we do need to remember that the work is institutional, interpersonal, and internal, which does mean taking the pulse of your organization and tailoring to its needs. And finally, the work is iterative. DEI is a buzzword right now, but if you treat this work as a checkbox activity, you are not going to see the results that you're hoping for. So Audrey, let's start at the beginning. What do we mean by diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Oh, it's my favorite question. And in fact, I'm going to do this a couple times because we have folks here. Do folks have a standard definition that they use at their company for any of those terms, for diversity, for equity, for inclusion, or not so much? You can put a hand up in the box if you have a definition, or in the chat. Not so much. Eva, Lisa, Stephen. All right. That's really important to know because you have a place to start. And the reason why we want to have a shared definition, and even if we use one MARIANA strategies and you use something different, that's fine. It's going to be apples to apples within your organization, which is what's important, right? If I think diversity means one thing and you think it means another, we'll be measuring two different things if we're trying to make progress. So just to set some groundwork, when we're talking about diversity, we're talking about variety, right? We're talking about representation of a range of identities in the workplace, right? And we've listed a few up here, but this is not comprehensive. And some of these may be more relevant to some workplaces than for others. And what matters is identifying what pieces need to be present in your workplace. So an important way to think about diversity is our workplace as diverse as the community or communities we work with or serve? And if it's not, then there's work to be done, right? Next, we're thinking about inclusion, right? It's funny, right? When we think about the feeling of exclusion, it's really salient, right? It's strong. People can think of experiences where that was present. But when you ask people what the feeling of inclusion is like, they say, it just feels good. But social scientists and researchers have been able to identify what those pieces are and how it affects people in the workplace. And that sense of inclusion is a feeling of being respected and valued for your uniqueness and a sense of belonging altogether. And those two pieces, diversity, inclusion, those are things that we can measure, right? We can set standards and see how we're achieving or not on a sense of inclusion, on our metrics for diversity, on hiring and retention. And finally, equity. So we're talking about fairness and impartiality and adjusting to address that unfairness as it happens in workplaces, right? We talk often about the issue of pay equity, right? Doing a pay equity analysis to ensure that similarly skilled people doing the same job are paid the same. That's an important aspect of equity in the workplace, right? So the reason we start, and that this discussion is about beginner strategies for inclusion, is that you likely have some aspects of diversity in your workplace, right? We're going to assume there's some diversity. And unless we focus on inclusion, it will be difficult to keep people of diverse backgrounds that we've hired and have them grow and thrive there. You remember the data from 2 slides ago, where nearly half of respondents in a poll who identified as Black or Hispanic said that they experienced harassment or discrimination at work. And something like 30% have left jobs because of it. We don't keep people when they feel that sense of exclusion that comes from harassment, from discrimination. And it can come from the sense of exclusion that's big or small. And I want to share just one image that I think helpfully encapsulates this experience, just for one industry. So in the legal industry, what we see is that women are represented very broadly at the level of junior associates. So in the legal industry, within law firms, and this representation is from the consulting firm McKinsey, and it is their data on North American law firms, that at the junior associate level, the most junior level, white men and men of color are represented not equally, but at 53%. For women, that is at 47%. So the pipeline in 2017, 48% of women, right? When you're looking at the highest ranks that individuals achieve in law firms, being an equity partner, that really, it dwindles for women, both women of color, especially women of color, and women who identify as white. And when there is exclusion in that industry, that representation goes away, right? We can hire, but we will continue to hire and have that be depleted. These people will not stay unless there is inclusion in that culture. With that in mind, Swati, why don't you talk us through where we should start to tackle this issue?
Absolutely. And actually, before we delve into those beginner strategies, let's take a quick look at what everyone has just shared with us regarding their thoughts on their organization's challenges in building inclusive cultures.
Let's do that. I'm going to put that up here on the screen and we'll scroll through. Oof. Trying to slow down that scroll. Can folks see?
Okay. Nothing shocking or surprising. What do you think, Audrey?
These are the kinds of challenges we hear about often.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And hopefully you'll get some answers as to how to address them.
For sure.
So let's talk about that. Today, we are going to cover some very basic principles for this work. One of the challenges that I saw over and over again in that, what you just shared, Audrey, is leadership buy-in. And I just talked about that a few minutes ago. As with any change that affects an entire organization, leadership buy-in is a necessity. And you can't take no for an answer. You know, I did, but you guys are attending this and hopefully you will have some answers to come back to leadership with. You know, hearing things like it's not the right time, we have too much else going on, we don't have the resources. The truth is that this work is very, very important and inevitably will save you time and expense in the long run. And as Audrey just noted about trends in the workforce, Not addressing it will certainly cost your organization. So that is the first and foremost thing to go to leadership with to get that buy-in. The next thing we're going to talk about is assessing the situation, right? Like, people don't know where to start when it comes to this work. And in order to make a change to an organization's entire culture, you want to know what the state of the culture is currently. So asking those questions, getting perspectives of people across the organization, it's an essential first step in this work. The third principle we're going to discuss is establishing a DEI working group. Asking ourselves, who is going to lead on this initiative? How will people charged with doing the work be set up to be successful? Next, we're going to discuss the 3 pillars of inclusion. For us, that means, do people feel valued, trusted, and able to be their authentic selves at work? We've looked at the research, we've looked at what social scientists have said, and we've looked at our own work and the themes that have come across. And this is what seems to really build inclusion in a workplace. The 5th principle we're going to discuss are making your meetings more inclusive. Meetings are a sticking point for a lot of people. They're a place where individuals either feel valued and trusted and belong, or they don't. Getting this right is going to get a lot of things right for you. And then finally, we're going to talk about accountability. How we approach this work by setting goals, measuring progress, and sharing that information with stakeholders all rolls up to this notion of accountability. So let's flesh these out a little bit more.
All right, let's start at the obvious place with leadership buy-in. For folks who are here, do you feel like you have leadership buy-in, or are you here to gather the facts and the evidence that you need and the support to make the case for it? So leadership buy-in, do you have it? Carrie's got it. That's great. Eva, okay. Some folks, yes. All right, and some folks working on it, right? Jessica, yes. Mark needs the facts to make the case. Lisa, yes, somewhat. Definitely have. All right, facts, great. So anyone here who, and we're seeing a little bit of both. Anyone here who is familiar with principles of change management know that you're not going to get anywhere without leadership's full-throated support. And that means the resources that go into this, the willingness to recognize that this is an iterative process, that we won't be successful on every point from the start, and we need to be comfortable with that. These are all really significant and things that we need to think through. So we want leaders to be educated on what's required to implement and sustain inclusive culture practices. So something that I think was interesting, and we're going to share this at the end, is some research from folks who are at Deloitte, Juliet Bork and Andrea Titus, who found, the things that we talked about already, that a sense of belonging comes from feeling valued, trusted, being treated with respect, treated fairly. You can be yourself. This comes up in workplace climate, workplace culture, your policies, practices, mission. But in their research, they found that what leaders say and do makes up to a 70% difference as to whether someone feels included. And this really matters, because when people feel included, that's when they speak up. They go the extra mile. They collaborate. I will once again take my favorite book off the shelf that supports this research. This is Christine Poirath on mastering civility. She uses the word civility. I don't like that word as much as respect, but I think in the workplace, they all go to the points that Bork and Titus are making, that when people feel included, when they feel respected, your individuals go the extra mile. They stay, and that comes from leadership. They said that inclusive leaders share 6 signature traits. That visible commitment. And we know that means this year, being able to talk about things that you may not be comfortable talking about. For instance, white people in leadership needing to be comfortable talking about racist Black police violence, right? being able to talk about the experience that people have in anti-Asian violence in America, right? It might be something that you weren't trained on, but having that authenticity and visible commitment goes to the next point, which is humility. Being modest about your capabilities, admitting your mistakes, being able to talk about things that you might not have a lot of experience with, and making room for others who do. Having awareness of your personal blind spots, flaws in the system, what systemic racism looks like, and working hard to ensure that we can adjust for that through practices of equity, curiosity about others with an open mindset, being able to listen without judgment, seeking empathy. These are aspects of emotional intelligence we use quite a lot. And then that cultural intelligence and being able to effectively collaborate. That's quite a lot of information. And we're going to share a link to the article at the end. But when we want to see this put into practice and leadership's commitment, these are the pieces that are most significant. And that's why we'll be talking about that in an entire separate discussion on August 12th, just focused on leadership and DEI. With that, let's ask a next question. So we want to think about what inclusion in the workplace has felt like. Now, before you jump to the Menti, I am going to ensure that the slide that you get to answer is the right one on this page. So let's jump to how you have felt included in the workplace. So you should be able to answer that question now, and I can put the link to the Menti back in the chat for you as we think about that. And you can also, of course, go to menti.com and use the code 8473-1402. Or you can click on the link that I just shared. We'll put this up for you again. But the thing that we're thinking about are identifying the ways that you have felt included in the workplace and what that has meant. So we'll give folks a minute. Swati, do you have an example that you might share?
Yeah, I have many. Certainly when I have been in a meeting where I was simply asked to attend and observe, but people in the room asked for my opinion anyway. Amazing feeling valued, feeling like my contributions meant something, even though I was really there just to be an observer.
Great one.
What about you, Audrey?
The feeling of inclusion, that definitely came from, I can think of a moment when, this was early on in my legal career, when opposing counsel, we were in the courthouse and opposing counsel made an inappropriate remark to me about my physical appearance. And my partner mentor who was with me turned around and said in no uncertain terms how inappropriate it was. I felt very valued in that moment, and that my supervisor would go to bat for me when I needed it.
That's awesome.
Let's see what folks put in the Menti. We haven't gotten any responses. Did anyone have difficulty getting in?
And actually, if you want to share the link, or if people want to follow the link and share some of their ideas, let's maybe talk about the responses in a little bit when we talk about inclusion. And let me talk everybody through what it means to assess the situation before you start doing this diversity, equity, inclusion work.
All right, I just fixed the link. Thank you for that. I'm seeing the original question come back, but you should now have the right link up there. But let me pull up for Swati the assess the situation. details. There you go.
Oh, hold on a second. All right. So yeah, let's talk about assessing the situation. DEI work is personal. It's personal to you, to your teams, to your organization. So you can't really let others come in and tell you what you need, not even us, not even consultants, nor can you allow yourselves and a few leaders to figure out what's best for an entire organization. When you're contemplating inclusion work, you really have to start by including everyone's voices from the onset. Assessing the situation basically means listening, seeking to understand from employees what they feel has already been achieved in creating a diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplace, and what work still needs to be done. Doing an initial assessment is going to provide you with a baseline against which you can measure your progress, and it will inform your future DEI work, particularly goal setting and measuring progress. Now, surveys are important because they allow you to hear directly from individuals about their experiences. And they also help you identify trends and prioritize topics across the organization. And given the sensitive nature of this topic, it's very important that people are able to share their information confidentially. So the best way to achieve this is by using an outside vendor. And if you don't currently have the time or resources to do that, you can go back and review your latest employee engagement or employee culture surveys, which typically do include some inclusion items. And if you don't have that, you can create a quick confidential internal poll. But whatever you do, it's very important that you start by listening to your workforce, which leads us to what are the types of things that you need to know. So some questions that go into inclusion surveys are going to be along the lines of asking employees if they feel valued at work for their unique skills, if they feel like decisions or their decisions are trusted, if they feel like they can be themselves at work. So there are several sample inclusive culture surveys that are available online. For example, there are a few on SurveyMonkey. That we feel are good enough to at least get a basic sense of where your organization stands and where the gaps are that you need to identify.
And we will be sharing a link in the resources that we'll send out after our discussion today to one of those SurveyMonkey surveys for you to look at. So the next piece, after we have leadership buy-in and we're assessing the situation, is thinking about that DEI working group, the folks within the organization who are tasked with doing this work. Do folks have DEI working groups where you are? Maybe a show of hands or a note in the chat. Many. Many DEI working groups. Okay. Okay, some yes, some no, a big nope. All right. So let's say we were going to stand up a new program at MARIANA Strategies. We're going to have a new division, right? If we were to do that, we would consider what our expected return on investment would be, what the market is for the new program, the work it delivers, why it's needed. That's our business case, right? For setting up the new program. Well, the same analysis applies to standing up a DEI working group. If we've established that it's necessary to make that adjustment within our workforce, then we need to set it up for success, right? When we set up a new program, right? Hypothetical program X here at MARIANA Strategies, it has to be connected to the success of the organization, right? We need to know how much time and who will be engaged in this work. It's not an add-on. And this is very different from affinity groups, right? This is the effort of standing up a piece of the organization that will affect how the business runs, how the nonprofit runs, whatever the entity is. So we need to know how much time and who will be working on it. We need to think about what the goals are and how we know whether we've met them, what our level of success is, what the key performance indicators are for the work, right? And the people who are engaged, this is going to be part of their job description because it's taking up time during their business week. And if it's a change in role, and deserves a raise, it deserves a raise, right? LinkedIn recently decided and announced that the individuals working on diversity, equity, and inclusion within LinkedIn as a company would be receiving additional funds on top of their baseline pay to be able to do that work. It's just one example. And then, as with any new program, senior leadership engagement is crucial, right? You need the ear of senior leadership or senior leadership within that committee for decision-making authority and for resources. So these things seem to look apples to apples, right? Our DEI working group affects all aspects of an organization. When we're doing this work, you need to be able to allocate work hours. These pedestrian items like needing a billing code for the time that you spend doing this work. Knowing that your success will be measured with key performance indicators, reaching goals, having it be part of your job description, and having that engagement. Senior leadership, right? Makes sense. Swati, what about the pillars of inclusion?
Sure. So here at MARIANA Strategies, when we talk about building an inclusive workplace, we always start with a discussion of the 3 pillars of inclusion, which we've been alluding to quite a bit already. Now, as we've mentioned before, not everyone feels like they can define the word inclusion, but you likely can remember feeling included. So Audrey, let's pull up the responses to our Menti poll. Let's take a look at what we're...
It looks like there was still some difficulty in pulling up that, being able to answer that question. So I'm wondering if folks might want to share anything in the chat about their experience of inclusion.
Absolutely. Feel free to share in the chat. And I am, in the interest of time, going to kind of keep going. But I think what we're going to see are a lot of themes that are going to jump out in terms of these 3 pillars. Chances are, if we asked you to think of experiences where you felt excluded, you would remember those feelings even more vividly. And what that means is that efforts to facilitate inclusion sometimes become overshadowed by those experiences of exclusion. Now, generally, employees experience inclusion and exclusion at the same time. So for example, you could be at a meeting one morning where your colleagues are actively listening and giving full consideration to each other's ideas. So you contribute and you feel engaged. And then later the same day, you're in a meeting where you sit in silence because you feel like your contributions won't matter anyway. One of these events doesn't negate the other, but by effectively managing the coexistence of the 2 experiences, leaders are able to ensure that their workplaces and employees reap the benefits of inclusion and mitigate the costs of exclusion. So what does inclusive leadership look like? Well, research shows that employees feel included when they feel valued, trusted, and able to be their authentic selves. This means being respected for your talents and perspectives, being trusted in your contributions and decisions, and being able to express yourself without having to alter or tone down who you are. So let's talk a little bit now about how these pillars apply to something like what I just mentioned, managing meetings.
That's one of my favorites, managing meetings. But I love this, what we're seeing in the chat in response to Swati's question, being invited to weigh in on new projects and programs, or being asked for my perspective on a project and being asked to work together on a project, or when taking time off from my religious holidays is treated with respect. It's not an inconvenience. These are so important. Some of these might feel in the moment big, might feel in the moment small, but to just feel like you're able to focus on your work and that this doesn't affect a feeling of inclusion, that you get to be yourself, means a lot to people, right? And speaking of the things that can be big and little all at once, meetings. Okay, one last question I have to ask. How many people here have felt in their careers that they have attended an unnecessary meeting? I want to see every hand. Come on, you know it. You've attended an unnecessary meeting. I feel like that was in part one of the reasons why I, as a parent, needed to start my own company. I could not be subject to any more meetings that I did not have time for. Now, only the most necessary ones. But we want this for everyone. And so pulling apart from there, the unnecessary meeting point is the feeling of exclusion in meetings. There is a scenario that we use in our inclusive culture workshops, talking about an individual, happens to be a man, who talks over his female colleagues and takes credit for her ideas. In this scenario, it always results in the women in the group talking about how common and how frustrating this experience is. And it's not only the anecdotal evidence that supports the fact that this happens. The research shows that women are often uncomfortable speaking up in meetings, and that they're more than twice as likely to be interrupted in group dialogue. And that's particularly in industries and organizations that are male dominated. Similar research has shown that men from groups, men who identify as people of color, feel similarly. So with that in mind, we can say something in the moment if we notice it, if we feel comfortable. The more consistent approach, the one that's tied to inclusive workplace culture, is to set those expectations ahead of time, right? There was research cited by Gartner, and we're including a link in the resources that we'll be sending out, that found that a 2019 survey estimated that the cost of ineffective meetings is nearly $400 billion in the US and $58 billion in the UK. So if you need a business case for arguing for more inclusive meetings, this is one of them. So meetings have norms for better or worse. And if we hold meetings, whether or not people are prepared, with or without an agenda, those are our norms, right? And if we want to have good meeting hygiene, then it's as simple as creating the right norms and sticking to them. And the ones that really address inclusion are what you're seeing up here on the calendar invite on the right-hand side, that we encourage participation by all. We avoid interruption. We engage in active listening. We take space and make space. And that, for meetings, it goes beyond just having norms, is someone who's there to make sure that we're sticking to them, an MC for the meeting. So with that, a recommendation that there's someone to say, this is our agenda, we're sticking to it. These are our expectations. We need to be able to speak without interruption, right? And for someone to do that can be very powerful. So there's a question in the chat about expanding on take space, make space. Thank you for that question. If I am only one person on the agenda and I have a certain number of minutes, and then I just keep talking and I'm taking space expansively at the exclusion of others, I need to be aware of that and dial it back so that I'm making space for other people to participate. And really going to that part where the research I mentioned earlier, that for many women and many men of color, for individuals who identify as people of color, they feel uncomfortable speaking up. How do we make people feel more comfortable speaking up? We're suggesting that the MC for the meeting greet everyone when they come into the meeting. Very, very simple things that make people feel like they belong in the space, that they're encouraged to participate. So that's what we mean by take space, make space. And even asking questions about whether the meeting was effective can have an impact on whether or not you decide to continue holding the meetings. This is a data-informed decision to continue having these meetings. So thinking about what your norms are for them, that your norms are inclusive, that you're making good use of people's time by having an agenda and sticking to it, and that there's someone there to enforce it, can make a huge difference in how our meetings are run. And we're going to send you, after today's discussion, a worksheet that includes these recommendations and a template that you can suggest for use in creating more inclusive meetings. But Swati, why don't we talk about that very last point, the one that is probably most important around accountability?
That's right. I will tell you that if you want to see a return on investment with your DEI work, you need to hold yourself, your teams, and your organization as a whole accountable. I have decades of survey research experience, and I know for a fact that it's better not to do a survey or an assessment at all if there is no plan to act on it. So, what do we mean by accountability? First and foremost, define and clearly communicate specific, measurable, and time-bound goals. Again, listen to your workforce, conduct an audit of your policies and procedures, and identify shortcomings or discrepancies around inclusion that are based on the information that we've shared here today. Figure out what measurable changes can be made, and then commit to those priorities that have been identified by your employees. The next part of accountability is measuring your progress. Revisit your goals monthly, quarterly, whatever is right for your organization. Look at the data, identify the gaps, places you're making strides, and places that need more attention. And then communicate your progress to your stakeholders. And by stakeholders, we mean everyone, your entire workforce. And then third, communicate. And yeah, I did just say that, but I'm going to say it again because this is important work. And if you're going to bother to ask your employees their opinions and for their insights, they will be looking to find out what you're doing about it. So you need to be transparent from the start. Let them know you've heard their concerns, the goals that you've chosen and why, how you plan to measure progress on those goals, and then celebrate your successes and continue to collaborate and push that needle forward. From our perspective, we've given you a really good set of basic tools, and we feel like you can do this. And if you need help, MARIANA Strategies is here to partner with you and steer your organization on the path to success.
Going to that point that we know you can do this, we're sharing some of those resources. We will be sending an email afterwards with recommendations with these specific resources. And we think that these will help you on good meeting hygiene, on the arguments for leadership support and leadership engagement, the polling and survey work that you can do internally, and then standing up a diversity, equity, and inclusion working group. The Annie Casey Foundation talks a lot about setting up that working group and how important that is, and the very practical details on how to do it.
So I'm going to share a registration link here for our upcoming discussions. If you guys found this discussion helpful today, we will also be sharing a recording of it along with all of the resources that Audrey just mentioned. Next time, we plan to talk about inclusive leadership strategies, what leaders need to know. And in September, we will talk about handling blind spots. So I know that we are quite at the end of the hour, and we'd like to take some time if you guys have any questions. You can feel free to put them in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask.
I have a question.
Please.
So I'm wondering, it's a question about leadership buy-in.
Mm-hmm.
So we have as I said in the chat, a nascent DEI committee that is sort of part board and part senior staff. And our executive director has been she feels it's really important for her to be part of that committee because I think she knows how important it is to have leadership buy-in and also kind of leadership from the top in DEI work. But my question is, how important do you think it is to have the executive director actually part of the committee or working group? And the reason I ask is, it's kind of two things. One, I think from the perspective of her workload, I don't know how this ranks compared to like fundraising, for example. And there are a lot of things on her plate, and this seems like it could eat up quite a bit of time. And the second thing is, if we want the DEI working group or committee itself to be fairly inclusive, I kind of worry about someone with that much power being in the working group, and unintentionally preventing other people, other staff members perhaps, or board members from sharing their feelings or kind of taking it in a different direction from how our executive director would go. So just curious about your thoughts on that.
Can I give it a start? Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Eva, how do I pronounce your name?
It's Eva, yeah.
Eva, thank you. So this is a place where preparation will help, setting some parameters in advance, because one thing that an executive director can bring that is so valuable and other people cannot is that decision-making authority to have things move maybe a lot faster than if we have to send things up and then down again. So there's a lot of value in that. But I'm also hearing that you're anticipating some of the ways in which it could go off the rails, might cause difficulties. And that's where I would suggest the measuring twice and cutting once. Swati knows I've already said that today in another meeting. All right. Love the aphorisms. And I would recommend taking a look at that Annie E. Casey Foundation report, because setting up those guidelines and the expectations, because you can, just like you said, get in the weeds and then stay in the weeds. And we want to avoid that for someone who has so much on their plate, being able to set those parameters in advance. And if you have other questions about this, give us a call. We're happy to talk through it.
Absolutely. The only other thing I would add to that is that, even though that direct involvement from top leadership in the working group would be fantastic, as long as you make a commitment to keeping the top leadership in the loop, whether that's like a bi-weekly, monthly, and whether it's over email or just like a quick 20-minute meeting and, hey, here's what's going on with the working group and here are all the strides we're making. Again, you want the involvement, but in a way that is beneficial to both sides.
Great. Any other questions? Or I know that we saw some really interesting challenges that folks were facing.
Yeah, a follow-up to that is then how involved should leadership be? Because if the committee's doing all the planning and the working and the, cool, when is the leadership just, okay, let me know what y'all come up with and I'll approve? Well, it's like, no, you should also be part of the process so you know what I mean? So what's the balance there?
I think that it's going to be specific to each organization, but what you don't want to have happen is for that working group to put in all that effort and then have it stall with leadership. So setting that decision-making authority with the group, the expectations from the start can be significant, or identifying what the parameters and expectations are of the group makes a difference as well. Does that answer your question, Idris?
Swati, go ahead, because I think you were about to add on to that as well.
All I was going to say is that I think, to Audrey's point, the specific milestones and markers of where you're keeping your top leadership in the know is going to be very specific to your organization, depending on the size and the industry, as well as what people have on their plates and how much they can actually afford to contribute. But that in the know needs to be there from start to finish. Because of what you just said, you don't want a working group to be doing all of this work for, like, let's say 3 months. And then when it comes time to set the goals and do the action planning, all of a sudden leadership's like, no, we can't do this, or we have to push this back. So keeping people in the know and making sure that the working group is very well aware of what their own parameters are, how far they can take things. And remembering that, again, as we mentioned, you're not going to be able to do everything at one time, not even within 1 year. It's a long iterative process. So as long as you are working with leadership and keeping that needle moving, I think that's the most important thing.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, thank you, Audrey and Swati. That helps.
Sorry, I cut you off, Swati.
Oh, no, you didn't. Well, I think we have a minute to give back to everybody.
Respecting people's time is high on our list of how people feel included. You'll see that in the good meeting hygiene discussion. So thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be sending a recording for you to share. And if you have follow-up questions, please let us know. And if you could take a moment to give us your feedback, how this presentation was for you, that would be hugely valuable. Swati?
Yep, and don't forget to register for the next session. We hope to see you all again. Thank you again for joining.
Have a good day.